Hi everyone, this is Serene, and in today's episode, I'm so honored to invite Beverly Behan on our podcast. So she is worked with nearly 200 boards of directors over the past 25 years, and almost like Fortune 500 companies to recent IPOs and across the US and around the world. She considered one of the foremost experts on the board effectiveness worldwide. And I am actually holding her book. I really enjoy the reading process. I learned a lot and it's very insightful, not only for someone who work with the board, even if you're just a professional, you always have big meetings in your company, this book can be really helpful as well. Okay, I will give the mic to her because she has a lot to say. Hi, Beverly.
Hi, Serene. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm delighted that you like my book, Becoming a Boardroom Star.
I enjoy it. So except for the long list that I just introduced about you, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more?
No, I sometimes say that I have the greatest job in the world because I get to work with really smart, accomplished, successful people because those are the people who either sit on boards or work with boards. And I get to help them sort of achieve their potential in overseeing organizations, and it makes a huge difference for the organization. When I first started working with boards, which, I'll really date myself, was back in the mid 1990s. Boards were like a country club. Okay. It was just considered a great honor to be on a board. And no one really expected the board to provide a lot of oversight over the company or to add much value. That all changed with Enron 20 years ago when Enron fell, and boards started to become far more, engaged and fulfilling their fiduciary duties. But for most boards, there's still a lot of opportunity to really continue to raise their game. And that's what I get involved with. So I think I have one of the greatest jobs in the world.
Thanks for sharing that. I see your background. You have a very interesting academic background. You have both a law degree and an MBA. Did either of these disciplines prepare you for your work with boards of directors?
Well, certainly not directly. I mean, you even if you see some kind of governance course, which is quite rare in a law school or business school, it tends to be more on the regulatory side. And a lot of my work is on the practical side. So it's not about writing charters or anything like this. It's once that's all in place, making sure that it's working and it's working really effectively. So I would say both a business degree and a law degree lay the foundation. Boards are overseeing, in my case, most of my clients are public companies. So you have to have certainly some sense of how the business world works. And they're operating within a legal framework in terms of both, SEC requirements, stock exchange requirements, things like that, fiduciary duties. So it lays a foundation. But, as we were talking earlier, one of the most interesting things is that most people don't receive any training whatsoever in terms of how to work with a board.
Yes.
Now, if you got that early in your career, even if you got it in college or grad school, it's probably too early because you're some years away from going in the boardroom. So I kind of understand why that doesn't happen. But it's so important for anyone's career because by the time you're working with the board is obviously going to make some judgments about your capabilities, your communication skills, whether you have a thoughtful approach to the strategic issues you're dealing with. So how you come across in the boardroom is essential to your success. And yet very few people get any guidance around that. They tend to learn from watching their boss, and they pick up both good and bad habits along the way.
So just out of curiosity, so what makes you to choose like law school and then MBA, and then how is it transition to the work you're doing right now? I know this is going to be a long story, but is there a way you can summarize it for us?
Well, it was my father wanted me to be a lawyer. I guess because, at the time I was coming through school, which was in the 80s, he felt that a woman needed some kind of professional designation to be taken seriously. So although I preferred business, he wanted me to get a law degree.
So you did both.
Law school to me was actually very easy. But I didn't like it. And I hated practicing law. In fact, I practiced law for about 5 years, and, they threatened to make me a partner. So I left. And then I did an MBA, and then I started working for this airline actually in Canada. And that's where I first got some exposure to these issues, because this airline was in a lot of trouble. You can't go into Chapter 11 in Canada as you can in the United States. Once you're bankrupt, the game's up. You can't continue operating. So we did a deal with our unions that I got involved with, where we would do a wages for stock deal in order to try to save the company. And I will tell you, the morale in the place was right through the roof. And all of our employees, from our pilots to our flight attendants to our ticket agents, had all agreed to give up some of their salary in order to become shareholders in the company. And we had a board that was filled with marquee name directors, people who'd been on the cover of business magazines and what have you. And it became very evident that they had a very much of a country club mentality. They made some very bad decisions, particularly about leadership. And one thing they did is, in the middle of all this, when we had negotiated wage cuts for all our unions, they gave the CEO a raise. And they then put out a statement that basically said, oh, well, because he's under so much stress, we gave him a raise, and then we levied, his contribution. Well, that did not go over well. We actually had some wildcat strikes at some of our airports. The board then decided they wanted to send a letter to the homes of all the employees, basically telling them to be quiet and stop criticizing the CEO. Well, we just made all these people shareholders. So, they were like, hey, you're on the board. You're supposed to represent us. So that really went over like a lead balloon. That then caused, the morale in the place was just being destroyed as all this was going on. The CEO had then become a lightning rod for all of this. They decided they had to get rid of him. This was an airline. They ended up offering the job to a guy who ran a commercial real estate company, and it happened to be in the same office tower in Calgary as the airline. So people said, where did they meet this guy? I mean, he has no background that we know of in transportation. He runs commercial real estate. They said they must have met him in the elevator or the lobby, and made him the CEO. And so it was this whole series of missteps. That company no longer exists. 30 or 40,000 people lost their jobs as a result of it. And that's what got me interested in boards. And I wasn't interested in, the regulatory compliance side, which is essentially putting a lipstick on a pig so that it can, pass muster at the SEC. I was interested in, no kidding, how do you take all these smart, successful, accomplished people that sit around a board table and help them achieve their potential and make a board all that it should be. And I've had the great privilege of doing that for the last 25 years.
That's such an amazing story. I love it. And I like all the analogy. It's fun. So what's the coolest thing about your job, except for all that excitement?
Well, I think two things. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, I have the privilege of working with really smart, successful, accomplished people. And it's fun, and we work on major issues. And my job is to try to unleash some of that potential and reframe things to get them working well, and making a big difference. I take great pride in my job where executives come out of a board meeting and go, wow. And I don't think that happens enough, but I've certainly had it happen with boards that I've worked with. So I think that's a really cool thing. I think the second thing is, unlike many facets of business, corporate governance and working with boards and board effectiveness is actually a fairly new area. I mean, when I first started working with boards 26 years ago, hardly anyone was doing this. And so I kind of experiment a lot, and I innovate, and I'll work with a company or a board and say, hey, let's try this. And it works really well for them. And so it's fun because it's a field that allows you to try new things and innovate, which I love.
So talking about that, so if I am a young executive working with a board for the first time, and luckily I am in that position. So if I want to work with a board for the first time, what do I need to know to be effective in the boardroom?
That's a great question, Serene, because as I mentioned earlier, typically you want to have had any sort of training or guidance on that at any stage in your career, even if you went to grad school or law school or, whatever, MBA school. So the first thing I think to bear in mind is that your presentation to the board starts before you ever go into the boardroom or log on to a board video call. It starts with your pre-reading materials.
Mhm.
And that may sound like a dull area, but that's where the board is first kind of, forming an impression about you. They're getting a sense of what you're going to talk to them about. And if they're reading your material and they find that's kind of a data dump, it's not coherent, it's not prioritized, they form a bad impression before you even stand up to speak, because they don't think you did a good job in doing that. And a lot of executives, quite frankly, are lazy. They will repurpose the material they used for the internal meetings in their company for the board. Well, guess what? The board's a completely different audience. Many of them aren't even from that industry, and they're certainly not running the company day in and day out. And yet they'll use this kind of terminology. They just won't take the time to rework the materials. I will say that having worked with nearly 200 boards, 70% of them think that their board pre-reading material is an area to be improved. So if you really devote some time on that and really tell the story and make it clear and make it understandable, far too many executives tend to talk at the board instead of to the board. And I think that's sort of the second piece, is that when you get into the room, you want to assume they've read your materials. You don't want to be reading your slides. You want to give them, an overview of the key points, and then get the discussion going and try to, really have a dialogue. For many executives, they're intimidated by the board. They're a little frightened by the board. They're afraid the board's going to derail them. And so success to them is to get out of the room unscathed, right? But they tend to come across a little bit like a deer in the headlights. And what comes across much better is to, be confident, but also really listen to the board. And if you can't answer a question, don't fake it. Say, I don't have the answer to that at my fingertips. I'll get back to you, and do that. But really have a discussion. I mean, some of the best executives I see working with boards, they actually have a couple of questions for the board.
Mhm.
And, so if the board starts going a little off track, or if there's a real lull in the conversation, they might even say to the board, for example, this is our integration plan for this new acquisition. We think we've thought it through well. Do you think we're being too ambitious, or whatever it is, right? Because that shows that they're really confident, they're using the board, and they're treating the board as a thought partner. So there's a lot in there, but I think it's a really important area, because the board is always forming impressions of executives based on how they see them coming across in the boardroom, and it's really important for any executive's career to do well in there.
I love that. It's so insightful. So I love that you mentioned you need to do the homework beforehand. Good homework is very important for the first impression. It's not like when you show up. It's really good, like the material shows that you put the hard work. And then also, I love that you mentioned you need to be like concise and then sincere. Like, don't pretend you know everything. And it's okay not to know sometimes, and just to be honest.
Yeah.
I really love that because that's really helpful, not only for the boardroom, like in any company meeting. That's basically what we need to do. I love all that sharing.
Good. I'm glad.
Thank
I'm glad that was helpful, because I think it's very important for executives, and it also impacts the effectiveness of the board and even the board's decisions. You could have a really great proposal. Let's say you want to go into a certain line of business, or you want to do a deal, and it could be a really great idea. But if it's presented poorly to the board, they'll turn it down, even though it was a great idea. So how executives work with the board has a tremendously important impact on the board's effectiveness and the quality of the decisions they make. And ultimately, that impacts the company and the people who are the stakeholders of the company.
That's so important. Thank you so much for your sharing, and thank you so much for your time. If anyone in our audience have more questions about the board meeting, I would say just I will send those questions to our expert, Beverly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Serena. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Bye, everyone.